I have the great pleasure of being here with Christin Chong. Christin, thank you so much for joining me on the Middle Way podcast.
Thank you for the opportunity. This is so fun.
Before we even jump in, I just want to let listeners know that before we started rolling just now, Kristen invited me to take 3 mindful breaths with her, which I really, really appreciated. That was a first for the podcast and helped to center me. I also noticed how busy my mind was during that time and how much I was leaning into the future, AKA right now.
Hmm.
And I'm sure these are all topics that we will get into given your background and expertise. But I wanted to start out with your story. You have a very cool and interesting and impressive background. You have a PhD in neuroscience. You're training as a chaplain, as a Buddhist chaplain, and you do consulting work. But maybe if you can take us back a little bit and tell us how you got interested in the first part of the story in neuroscience, and then we can go from there.
Hmm. Thanks so much, Matthew. Actually, before we started too, I was telling Matthew that I will tell this story, though to be quite frank, I have no idea how and why I'm here. So this is definitely a retroactive retelling.
Same here,
Um,
Kristen. Same here. No idea.
yeah, exactly. So I want to say that I remember as a child being like thrusted into the heart of suffering quite early. My dad had a stroke when I was pretty young. And I saw the ill effects of that. Like he's paralyzed on his left side completely, and like he can't really talk properly. And I think that the most like upsetting part is that his mind is not quite there. Like he has uncontrollable laughter, just a lot of these symptoms that are very typical of a stroke. And so seeing that suffering really made me like really interested to understand, okay, how can we not have this, this is terrible. And that drew me into the field of neuroscience, and that's where I did my PhD. And However, I think one twist to the story is that I also remember as a kid that my family went through periods of like great poverty and also periods of like great financial success. However, the net happiness was actually about the same. like, it didn't matter either way. And I saw that, like, with my family, my parents are pretty atheist. My brother is like Christian on occasion. But I just saw that like no matter how much like financial like gain or loss happened, of course like loss was really like terrible and everyone felt bad. But then we're still on this like treadmill of like no matter how much money you make, there's still this like idea that one day you'll get old and sick and you lose it, that kind of thing. So also saw this like limitation of like our earthly goals, and like was thinking, okay, there must be a better way, right? Like there must be like something else we could aim for. However, I went to neuroscience at first and like got my training there, and I saw that like science was really great at answering the how about how our mind works in terms of biology. However, it's not really designed to be tackling the issue of like suffering and like what are our aspirations and what is the ultimate goals in life. And I found much more solace in answering these questions within the Buddhist context.
It's really fascinating that your experience, how you described your experience as a kid, seeing both sides of of financial life. I mean, maybe not having enough and having financial success, and in both of those, maybe recognizing the temporariness of money and
Mm-hmm.
how um, yeah, I guess the temporariness of it. And I'm wondering if that sort of drew you into kind of asking these more spiritual questions and down the path that you're on now.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and I feel really like I definitely don't want to compare myself with the OG Buddha, but then I was like, oh man, I got my version of the palatial living story. And so then like seeing the heavenly messengers and going like, oh man, I guess we have to figure this out. And I feel like that's something I see a lot in other like seeker types as well. There was like some early recognition that like whatever that life provides in terms of worldly goals, just doesn't seem quite satisfying enough. So I was
Mhm.
wondering, Matthew, to throw the question back to you, like what, what is the thing that got you onto the path?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think my easy answer is suffering, just like I'm sure the answer is for every other human being, stress and anxiety. But you have me thinking about kind of how your experience was relates to my own experience in a way, and what got me interested in Buddhism. And I think also that sense of like never like arriving, like you were describing with your family, like even when you have things, even when you have money, it's sort of never enough. You always feel like you need more. And I know my experience as a kid, like my mood, like, maybe not outwardly, but internally, like, was pretty labile. Like, I would, like, really vacillate between, like, feeling more anxious or down and then having more periods of feeling happy or more euphoric, and noticing the temporariness of that. That really got me interested, and I think initially interested in how do I just be happy? How do I always feel good? And then I
Mm,
started to realize that that is not a realistic or even helpful goal to have as a human being. And that probably drew me more towards studying and practicing Buddhism and mindfulness, and being able to kind of just first recognize the temporariness of everything,
mhm,
that everything changes. And really now, I'm really working deeply with this practice of like this moment being enough. Because no matter how much we have of anything, money or material things or a feeling or whatever, there's always that anxiety, that sense of insecurity around that, that we need to be able to secure that in the future. It creates so much anxiety and suffering. And so I think my practice right now is just like, yeah, this moment is enough. This moment is definitely enough, and just working with that. So I think a
mhm.
long answer to your reverse question, which I really appreciate. But yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Entrepreneurship is itself a spiritual practice, as we're both learning.
It's so true. It's so true. Yeah. So, so you got your PhD in neuroscience, and I know a lot of people at that point will usually pursue some sort of pathway, either in academia, or in biotech, or something in that realm. Tell me about what happened from that point, after you graduated. Where did you end up?
Yeah. So I want to tell this version of the story because, in case there are any budding graduate school applicants who are listening to this pod, so I after I finished graduate school, I had what's pretty standard, right? Of like, okay, now what? Like, I've produced a few papers. They were on multiple sclerosis. And I was like, okay, I'm pretty proud of this work. However, I wasn't sure what to do. I think that's the state I was in. So I kind of went into a default path. I was like, let me continue doing more research and then pursue a postdoc. So then I did like a postdoc for about 3 years studying the human genetics of sleep and circadian rhythm. However, during this time, I felt like academia wasn't for me. It requires a monastic like devotion, as you know, in order to get professorship. So then I was like, okay, like what else do people do? And I went into the industry after that. And I specialized in science communication in the biotech industry.
Mhm.
So I felt like in terms of like career choice, I was quite happy in terms of like oh okay, like I studied this much science and I really like talking about science, and to be able to find a job that was related to this interest was really fulfilling. Eventually, I felt like a sense of like I became like the marketing lead and et cetera in a big pharma company. However, I didn't feel a sense of satisfaction for myself because I felt like I want a greater sense of autonomy, and it's much harder to get that in a large company, right? So then I went into freelancing, and working in the same career choice, but still having this like revisiting this sense of like, wait, kind of set off trying to understand suffering. Like, how did I get here? So then came a bit more soul searching, and which led me to eventually participating in chaplaincy training.
Yeah.
So I can tell you a bit more about that.
I would love to hear more about this training and yeah, tell us what's involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think this is the challenging thing with like telling a life story, because like there was the career path line, but I think there was also the inner monologue and inner world line where I felt like, okay, like there were definitely periods of like great depression for me, where I felt like deep unhappiness, and that was one of my beginning foray into Buddhist practice. It was like coming from my own deep suffering and wanting a path out. And so with me, I discovered Buddhism from quite young, because it's like culturally. I grew up in Asia, where it's culturally much more embedded. However, it's a kind of Buddhism that's a lot more about praying to a Buddha and then for money or other worldly possessions and things like that sort of approach. However, I was exposed to the more Western, like meditative, ego transcending approach much more later when I came to the US. And like through the powers of the internet, I came across teachings from Gil Fronsdale, who had set up like this website called audiodharma.org, like way back in the day before podcasts were a thing.
Nice.
And I remember like listening to Gil and being like, wow, this person is so measured in everything he says. And like, no matter what he recommends you to do, he always says it in a way where you feel like he's not pushing anything, agenda. And
Mm.
that like, if you don't like what he's saying, you can just drop it. Maybe it's not helpful to you. And that really stood out to me as like, maybe this person's onto something, because whatever the goal of Buddhism practice is, if I can like be as nice as he is, I would already feel like that was a good thing.
Mm.
And so I became more involved in like the Insight Meditation Center after I was able to move to the Bay Area by coincidence, and that led me to deepen my practice. And eventually, it's very funny. I saw the flyer for the chaplaincy training like not a decade ago, but maybe at least like several years ago. And I always thought like one day I would do this when I'm retired. Because it's an expression of the practice, right? I'm like, okay, like I've learned this much. It'll be great if I can learn to provide it to like this kind of spiritual care to other people. However, I didn't feel like I was ready through whatever metric I had in my head, including having a job with enough like autonomy in terms of hours, right, in order to
Mm.
participate in such a training. However, I think after the pandemic, I discovered that I love writing about Buddhism, and I found myself in a place where I had a practice interview with Gil, telling him all about how much it turns out I love to write about Buddhism and share with friends. And he encouraged me to apply for the program. So I think it's like one of those like things where the simple answer would be, I did neuroscience, and then I discovered Buddhism, and then I try to like do even more with that. But in reality, it's like a flow of conditions and causes I don't actually understand. That kind of like came together to create the current situation.
I like how you described like kind of how there's these really two sort of storylines that can take place in someone's life. There's sort of the outer storyline, the thing that we can see, but then there's
Mm-hmm.
also the inner arc. And you mentioned for you, observing suffering very young in your life and a little bit later going through a period of depression, and being curious about Buddhism. I'm wondering, like, what was it that made you feel ready? Was it you mentioned you weren't ready at one time. Was it
Mm-hmm.
just that it started lining up more with your schedule, you had more free time, or like at what point did you decide, like, because it's a big thing to jump into,
Mm-hmm.
and you described spiritual care, and it's like that's like no joke. So like,
Mm-hmm.
how did you know you were ready to start diving into this type of work?
Yeah. It's very funny, right? Because there is a little bit of permission seeking with this exercise. So I felt ready when Gil says I can apply. I think that is the simple answer. It does really help when the meditation teacher you admire tells you that you are ready. However, I think subconsciously I had been planting some seeds. So I was actually looking into my journal, like gosh, a couple months ago, and I saw that back in 2017, I had written something like, and by at the time I was working a full time job, but I was writing about how it would be nice if one day I own my own little business that's like mildly profitable, and that I would be able to train as a spiritual care provider or teacher one day. So it's like, but however, it felt like a pipe dream. I was like, okay, I will somehow do these things when I'm older and wiser at an
Right.
undetermined date, right?
Right.
But there's been like little things I did without even realizing. So, for example, like, in trying to build a freelance business, like so that I can have autonomy of schedule, like deepening my own practice and like engaging in the dharma world through like building community and through like supporting a nonprofit for a while. That's related to Buddhism. So it's like little things that later went all into the chaplaincy application. We're already starting to build up. Oh, and there was another thing I did, which was like volunteer for Sidewalk Talk, which is a nonprofit where we literally just sit in a chair with a sign that says free listening, and we just listen to random people off the street with whatever issues they have, like not providing therapy, just free listening. So it's like there are these little things that I started doing, which I was like in my back of my mind, I'm just thinking maybe that's a great idea. I have no idea why, but I think I should do these things because it will be nice. But not having a very clear reason why. And only later on, like now I'm telling you the story of like, okay, like if I trace back, these are the things I did. But at the time, they are not conscious. They're just
Mhm.
like choices that seem like neat ideas.
Mhm. Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
I have a difficult question for you around
Mm-hmm.
this. You mentioned all of the wonderful work that you do as in this program as far as giving back, and of course this is part of practice, and not just Buddhism but other spiritual traditions as well, is charity work and giving back.
Mm-hmm.
Yet we live in a society, we live in a capitalist society,
Mm-hmm.
and you are an independent entrepreneur, and
Mm-hmm.
wondering how you balance and reconcile these things in your work. And this is coming from a place of genuine curiosity, I think,
Mm-hmm.
being very much being able to relate to that tension of wanting to give and doing that in a very authentic way. um and I'll just speak for myself here, but for me, I mean, there is also a desire there to do really well financially and be very successful.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that's hard to reconcile. I think some people have really figured that out, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious where you're at with that,
Yeah.
and what wisdom you can share with us.
Oh, thanks, Matthew. Um, I have no wisdom. I only have stories. So this is one intellectual way I'm reconciling it. So I think we have this association of like a Buddhist practitioner, someone who's like really long, like far along the path, as someone who's like monastic, right? Like they live completely off dana and generosity. They live very austere lives, and perfect role models for spiritual practice. However, in the suttas, there is the fourfold sangha, right? There is the bhikkhuni, the bhikkhu and the bhikkhuni, the monks and the nuns, and then there is the lay women and lay people in general who are part of this like support system. And so back in the ancient times, like the Buddha was really good about praising people. And he would say like, this so and so is my best disciple in type of like, activity. And I remember reading this book called Disciples of the Buddha. I think it's actually compiled by Bhikkhu Bodhi, where he talked about the best lay people, and they were the richest people in town. And they're the ones who are able to support all of the monastic activities through like, it's called like Jetta's Grove and all these like places, they were like built through patrons of the Buddha at the time, and they were absolutely loaded, but also considered really good practitioners because like they were able to, you know, use the money towards like generosity and supporting the practice while not being centrally attached to such wealth. So there's other stories that display how they have like really good restraints, etc. So I think like to me like I thought was really telling how it's like, that's strange that the best like disciples happen to be like, financially like quite well off, and yeah, it wasn't a criticized point. So I think a lot of it like it kind of like point to me like seeing that, oh, maybe like I'm using practice sometimes, or like the Buddhist teachings as a way to um obscure my own path in a way,
Mhm.
because it's kind of like
Mhm.
I'm because of my other hangups about finances, but I
Mhm.
don't want to address those. You see, it's more pure if I can say that it's like Buddhism is saying that I should be a little bit more
Mhm.
restrained in my financial pursuits, etc. So I think like that's one angle. And however, the other angle that I'm like doing for myself is that I'm really careful to not monetize the Buddha's teachings, like especially on its own. I do believe that is a very explicit like mentioning in the suttas as well. Like, it's like all the teachings are free. Like dana is accepted, of course. However, a lot of what I'm like bringing in terms of like entrepreneurship is much more around like the actual projects that you want to do themselves, or about writing, etc. So there's like a skill for which I am being compensated, and of course the way I teach like fundamentally is tied into my own belief system, right? However, like that's how I'm separating the two in my head, is that like of course I'll give you a package of like mindset and also the practical skill, but the part I'm actually charging is the practical skill part.
Mhm. Mhm. I think that's a really helpful separation.
Mm-hmm.
I love how you said as well how Buddhism, in a sense, I mean, could obscure our actual path, and maybe we would assume that if one follows their path and their destiny, then they are in the highest service to the world. And if that path includes whatever amount of success in any financially or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
then they are still being of service. It just makes me think about how like we can really get caught in stories about things, and even the story of needing to be monastic or
Mm-hmm.
needing to be austere in our lifestyle, maybe is a story, maybe is something that's revolving around ego,
Mm-hmm.
potentially, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I love how you put that, and really if the sort of practice is being less attached to ego, then we can do that, and we can have whatever, and it's about our relationship to it, and how we still give back to the world. So anyways, that's what was going on in my noggin as you were saying that.
Yeah, and like I definitely want to share with anyone listening that I this is definitely my practice edge, I think. Literally I was writing down a list of 20 of my deepest fears about money, just to like really understand the unconscious or subconscious parts of my mind that are relating to money in funny ways, right? And I
Mhm.
think like that's important to explore, especially as a practitioner, because it's like the Mara I fear is not the Mara that I think it is, if that makes sense. Because I think like the obvious, like the Mara I fear is like, oh, I'm gonna be one of like those people who use spirituality for financial gain. Like that's what I think I'm battling with, but in reality. It's actually disguised. Like my Mara is something else that's using this story to distract me. So yeah, definitely a battle of wits going on.
Fascinating, fascinating. Yeah, thank you for being so open and sharing on that. I think this kind of relates to, another topic that I wanted to talk with you about, which is just, how we practice Buddhism, or maybe just how we practice mindfulness in the Western world.
Yes.
And as you know, and as our listeners know, mindfulness has been the hot thing for a while now, for I mean over a decade.
Mm-hmm.
And as someone who is really immersed in Buddhist practice as well, I wanted to hear from you whether you think that mindfulness can exist on its own without that context, not necessarily of Buddhism, but of a framework of larger values and a world view, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
and that creates a context for our practice, and whether we can get lost
Mm-hmm.
without that, and whether our practice can lead us astray. So I know that was a lot, but please share any thoughts that you have.
I was really excited when you sent that as a discussion topic because I wanted to know, what spurred that on. So please do tell me after I go on my little soapbox here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so according to my teacher, so I want to say first of all, like, what is right view, right? I feel like I'm not in a position where I can autonomously generate right view, so I am, definitely adopting those of the teachers I admire.
And just
And
and just for listeners,
mhm.
tell us what you mean by right view.
Oh gosh. So what I mean by right view is that it's a component of the Noble Eightfold Path, which is what the Buddha advised as the practical solution to end all suffering. However, what exactly is right view is quite debated, even among Buddhists. And in fact, I think there is this like saying, possibly from the suttas as well, that like worldly people debate, worldly things, and practitioners debate views, but it's not seen as a good thing. So I think like. To me, right view is something that is getting us closer to liberation. That to me is the ultimate goal. So which I think is like ironically what you're pointing out is that now in the Western world, mindfulness is sometimes used as a tool, but it is separated from this ultimate goal of some kind of liberation or transcendence or something. And I feel like that is different from the way that the teachers I'm interacting with are teaching. Especially the that's one component, right? There's the idea that like there is an ultimate goal that we're aiming for, which is liberation, nirvana, nibbana, like all of that. But I think the second part is the ethical component, right? There is the idea of sila, like how like are you practicing while also keeping the precepts, which we can go into. And I personally feel like that's where sometimes like mindfulness alone starts to fall apart. Because like for me, like this is my own personal experience. When I'm not keeping my precepts to the degree that I would like mindfulness cannot be maintained. Like I can keep it up for a while, but like as we get deeper and deeper, like the defilements from not keeping precepts starts to get more and more magnified. It becomes like a funhouse mirror effect. So like to me, I feel like definitely some mindfulness is better than no mindfulness at all. However, it like then there becomes like a progression of like okay, like, now that we've started off with mindfulness, which is interestingly enough not the way that is taught in Asia. I think in Asia you actually start with ethics first.
Mhm.
However, I think it's like start wherever you can, start with something, and then like fill in the gaps. Like it's like okay, now that you've had a taste of mindfulness, do you see where there's instability and how you can maintain it? Like what are the factors, and then we can kind of get into like ethics and right view and all of these other components.
Hmm. Can you say a little bit more about the precepts and what precepts
Mm-hmm.
you practice that help to create this container for your mindfulness to
Mm-hmm.
flourish?
Yeah. So I mean the five precepts. Some of them are pretty obvious, like right, don't kill, don't like lie. I think the most controversial one is probably no intoxicants. So for me, I don't drink alcohol these days. So that's been helpful for me. However, I think like the more tricky conversation, which I would love to have your take on, is the use of psychedelics. I think like that's always been like the tricky line nowadays, especially in the West Coast, or like coastal areas where there's a lot more access to this kind of modality.
Yeah.
Um,
We can take a little sidebar and go into that cul-de-sac and maybe come back
mhm.
to this topic. Are you up for it into the
Yeah,
psychedelic realm? Because I'd be curious
yeah.
to get your thoughts too.
Oh, my thoughts are yet unformed, and I would love someone who's very qualified to have this discussion tell me
Actually, yeah,
their
well, this is
thoughts.
this is why I bring it up because I think I am not the person, to really to add much on this topic,
Mm-hmm.
both from an experiential realm and also just from I guess what would you say, like an objective or academic realm. I really don't know much about it. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
took mushrooms in college. That's all I have going for me right now.
Mm-hmm.
But I do have my own biases on it,
Mm.
which are I'm very open to it at this point, but up until this point, I think I just haven't wanted to do it for a couple reasons. I'm an anxious person and like
Mm-hmm.
drugs, they make me like more anxious.
Mm-hmm.
Like like smoking marijuana, like I usually like get more anxious, not less anxious. And I know some people are like that. And I think it's just like the fear of losing control. So like it never really appealed to me, A. And B, it kind of in the context of what we're talking about, like my bias is always felt like it was like a shortcut almost. And like
Mm-hmm.
I um I do things very, very slowly. I go really slowly. So like, even just my meditation journey and spiritual path, like I've never had like a big, like, oh my God, like I had like a total huge experience where like now I feel like I'm one with everything. And then from that point on, it was all no. It's just been a very slow, boring, gradual process of what I feel like is, a waking up process that's continues to unfold day by day in a very boring way. So I just and like I like that. And that's
Mm-hmm.
sort of the path that I feel suits me the best as far as my own process. That's what my
Mm-hmm.
intuition tells me is the most helpful thing versus
Mm-hmm.
sort of expediting that. But I'm trying to be open-minded to psychedelics and I really respect other people's experiences and it's maybe something that I would experiment with more. So that's sort of my take on it, just based on my own life experience. But I don't know if any of that resonates with you.
Oh, 100% actually. Same way. I feel like unfortunately a lot of these drugs don't work in my favor anyway, so so I don't feel like I'm missing out on much. But also like the teachers I admire tend to view them as shortcuts as well. In fact, when I use the word shortcuts, like, oh yeah, that's exactly the word they use too.
Mhm.
However, I do see that for some folks, especially if there is no access to spiritual practice, like either through, happenstance or like, if you are like experiencing like mental health issues, it's like it's just so hard, right? I don't think it's easy to expect people to meditate and do all of these things, and I can
Mhm.
see how like, you know it can be medicine, like, given you're working with trained professional who can give you guidance through the experience. So I feel like I'm a little bit torn, and I can only speak to my own keeping of the precepts, and in my own like expression of it, I don't partake.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about like, I don't know if you can see, but the handsome gentleman you probably can't see, like up here, Mr. Ram Dass on
Mm-hmm.
top of the shelf there. Like, I know that psychedelics, for him and many other people, they were some kind of like a doorway into spiritual practice. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's maybe how I'm thinking about it now is that like it provides an entryway, but it's not a substitute for the
Mm-hmm.
work that we actually do, like on
Yeah.
the ground, like
Mm-hmm.
in the world. That still has to happen, but maybe
Mm-hmm.
psychedelics could, can turn us on to that and show us what's our possibilities.
So can you tell me more about your boring path?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, it's like, I mean, I know a lot of people that are, into spirituality and many spiritual teachers too, like they've had like that big like experience. It was like the moment where like, oh my God, I realized that like it was all one.
Mm-hmm.
And from there I knew that I was going to be a spiritual teacher or whatever. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've had some really beautiful moments, and there are certain days when I feel really connected to
Mm-hmm.
everything, and it happens in a very subtle way.
Mm-hmm.
But that's been the process for me, is like a very slow peeling back of the onion of that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been my journey, like mental health journey, spiritual journey has just been that slow unfolding. And oftentimes like extremely like painful and not pleasant. Like I mean, the biggest and best awakening, I think, that a gift was like this, like a period of my life where I had like incredibly intense panic attacks for
Mm-hmm.
every single day for a period of like over a year, 1 to 2 years. This was happening, and that
Mm-hmm.
made me super grateful for life and for
Mm-hmm.
like just the days when like things feel okay. That was like an awakening process. So it definitely hasn't been like anything like super pleasant.
Mm-hmm.
Although I think it's allowed me to appreciate life a lot more and to have a lot more gratitude. And it just feels like day by day. It's just a learning process, and not a linear one either. It's just like forward and backwards, kind of like a maybe like a spiral movement. And that's just how it feels to me. And I sort of like that. Like it's a
Mm-hmm.
gradual process.
Yeah. So this is, I feel like, really related to what we're dancing around, right? It's like, this precepts is so boring and not sexy at all in terms of
Yeah, right.
practice.
Right.
So I was wondering, yeah, like what brought to mind this topic about discussing mindfulness and without the context of ethics and all the views and all the other things.
Yeah, it's something that I've been interested in for a long time. I think in the beginning of when mindfulness became really popular, this was a question that everyone was asking, especially in, I was kind of in the academic world ish, or at least, grad school and going to lots of conferences on mindfulness. And this was always a topic, is like, can the practice of mindfulness and meditation be extracted from its cultural and philosophical context, aka Buddhism and maybe some other traditions as well? Can it just be plopped out and plopped into the Western mind and people can practice?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like it's always been like a yes and no for me. Like in a way it can, because like it can help people to deal with pain, it can help people to deal with anxiety and depression. I mean, there's so much like, empirical evidence around secular mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always separated that from people who practice meditation for more spiritual reasons too, about, identifying as much with self and being more connected to the world around us. But I think the question came up again because now I'm wondering, like, even the secular approach, like, I'm not super convinced that it's like that as effective, maybe without that context. And I wonder, I just see people struggling with it so much. And maybe it's a projection for me, but I see people
Mm-hmm.
really struggling with practice. And
Mm-hmm.
the people who, um, preach mindfulness the loudest, like these are really deep practitioners. And quite honestly, I think oftentimes really emotionally healthy people.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people who have had trauma, who struggle with mental health,
Mm-hmm.
like they really struggle with practice. And I would just wonder, like, is this helpful for them? And if they do practice, do you need the precepts? Do you need context around it?
Mm-hmm.
Is there something different that would be more helpful? So I don't know if
Yeah.
that gives a more background.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing. Oh gosh. Actually reminding me, in the last Kind Camp session, which is the meditation and writing community I run, I remembered your in your film where you had mentioned that, oh, like, yeah, or like, actually it wasn't you. I think it's one of the experts you interviewed had mentioned that, breathing practice can be like trauma triggering. And I remember thinking, yeah, I gotta make sure I mention that. And often alternative. So then we were practicing box breathing. So
Mhm.
breathing in the 4-4-4-4 pattern. However, there's an apnea hold, right, of 4 seconds, and I can see like, oh yeah, this is totally triggering. It's like you're activating your autonomous nervous system by holding your breath sometimes. So then I was like, oh, I gotta remember like listening directionally or something like that as an alternative practice, and remembering to offer that. So this topic of like being trauma aware is completely top of mind for me. Um, and I feel like that's exactly it, right? Like the OG Buddha, like he was living in a completely different cultural context. Like, the people of his time, like they had their worries, but they were like, livelihood related worries, which led to a completely different kind of practice, and that we need to be taking account of like our current mental toxins that we are ingesting, and like, the current like zeitgeist of the way we're experiencing the world. These need to be accounted for when we ask people to practice.
Yeah.
So I remember like your film was really generous in its offering to remind us of this.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, what is the diet? What is the diet that we're consuming mentally, like as a culture? And like, is the practice the same, like
Mm-hmm.
practicing meditation if we have like a different diet? Like, I think we're all trying to figure out kind of how to adapt this to make it helpful for modern Western, I mean, and
Yeah.
Eastern, but just speaking about the
Mm-hmm.
society that we live in,
Mm-hmm.
to make it useful for modern society. And yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of traumas happening, and TikTok is changing our brain and
Mm-hmm.
rewiring it, and like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, like, is it just seems like it's like, even in Buddhism, like everything is context dependent. So like, is the practice even the same, like within a different context? And
Mm-hmm.
I don't doesn't need to
Yeah.
be adapted.
So when you were bringing up the boring path, that really like lit up my the little light bulb in my head, because I think that's what I am also trying to advocate for. And oh, we can cut this part, but please have oh, take your time.
Choking on water.
Oh,
Thank you, Kristen.
yeah. Get it out, get it out.
Okay.
Okay. Picking up on
Yeah, so let's take that again.
Matthew's boring path. Uh, okay. Are you okay? Like for reals?
For
I'm
real.
also
Okay.
the person among my friends who chokes on water for no reason.
Yeah, it's just like it happens all the time for no reason. I'm just, I think what you were saying was
Mhm.
so juicy,
Oh,
um, and so
bouncing off your
intriguing that
juice.
I started choking.
Yeah. So like, I think what you were mentioning about the boring path is it, right? Like, we're in this world right now where mindfulness is starting to be like a little bit juicy and interesting. However, it comes with this like expectation, which I think is causing some people distress. Is like, how come like I'm following these instructions, I'm doing everything on Headspace, it works for a while, and then it stops working. Like, there must be something wrong with me because these people look really yogic and peaceful, and I'm not. And
Mm,
I feel like this like need or like this drive to be like, no, it's just not you, it's because of the way it's presented.
mm,
It's not customized to your needs, and like the fact that we are living in this like overly stimulated world now that wasn't true in the context of the historical Buddha, and that we need to account for that as well. And so when it comes to what we're talking about TikTok, like I find that a large part of the peace that I'm able to gain in these longer retreats is not just the sitting, it's the fact that I'm detoxed from my
mm,
usual doses of like, digital stimulants, right? Like there is also this need to like take care of the inputs, the sensory inputs that we're receiving on a daily basis, instead of expecting people to like be busy all day with work, which is really necessary, and immediately break, like step on the brakes on a very fast moving car,
Yes,
sit quietly for
yes.
5 minutes, and magically become peaceful. Like that's never going to happen. Like that, because that's not a realistic expectation to put on people.
100%. And I'm realizing this has become an increasing difficulty for me right now in my practice. Like, if I'm feeling very scattered throughout the day and very busy and having so many different sensory inputs, trying to just put on the brakes, like, I wonder if it does more harm than good. I really have to de-escalate or decelerate very slowly. And for that's why I love the kind of trauma informed discussion. Like, what can people do as they're decelerating? Like, maybe it's a movement practice or doing a walking practice.
Mm-hmm.
But that's been huge.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to comment too on what you were saying about, like, just like how people are practicing and how it's being presented to people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I agree. Like, if people are practicing with the mindset of like, okay, like I have to do this practice in order to feel better, in order to get rid of some negative feeling that I'm having, or to like um improve myself, and then I'm getting frustrated around that. Like, all of that is like in service of ego. And I think this comes back to why this question came up around, like, do we have to have like the right view and the right frameworks around practice in order for them to truly be serving us? Because if we don't,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes an ego practice. And that's great in certain ways. It can be a really nice self-improvement practice, but as we all know, more ego equals more suffering. And so, are we just feeding our egos another practice to fatten itself up and
Mm-hmm.
and to cause us more suffering?
Yeah. Um, and I also want to emphasize that like I have this like also this imagery of like fattening up our ego, right? But what I've learned like through my own mistakes and like through wise teachers is that I think people think of someone with a high sense of ego to be like a tech bro who is like, pursuing like, spiritual practice and getting into jhanas and psychedelics. It's like one view. But like the insidious thing about ego is that low self-esteem and feeling bad and using practice to punish yourself is also a form of ego.
Yes.
And it's a very like twisted form of ego because you don't even see it. It's like, oh, like I'm already denigrating myself, I must be reducing my ego, right? But it's still increasing this like sense of self in order to flagellate it. And I feel like that's the hardest thing for me to, like, of course, deal with myself, but also to communicate with people because if I tell people this, then usually they feel worse and the ego grows even more. So I was wondering, like, in your experience, what are some ways that you've been able to point out the ego inflation issue without either upsetting people and inflating their egos even more or blinding them to this issue?
Yeah. Man, it's such a great point. eh, we just to kind of say again, basically what you said, but I think we think of people who tend to be maybe more anxious or depressed or like shy or quiet as like not having a big ego, but that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about that type of ego. We're talking about identification with ourself. And sometimes the most quietest among us can have, there's a lot of ego in that because there's a lot of attachment to ourselves and what other people think of us. And
Mm-hmm.
so, but to your question about like pointing that out, man, I mean, I think this comes back to what we were talking about before we started recording, is like, man, just like bearing witness to people's experience and being a mirror for that.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I would just worry that any sort of direct, even just trying to name that, verbally, can really just be confusing. And
Mm-hmm.
trusting that process of being more aware of that self can unfold. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and at the same time, I think, like, even from a mental health perspective, like, when you're treating anxiety and depression, for example, maybe you are helping with that process of softening ego a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Because you kind of have to, like, let's just say, like, so someone has social anxiety, you kind of have to like, the treatment is exposure. And so you kind of have to like just be okay with, I don't know. I guess maybe I'm having a hard time putting it into words, but I do think that it is a spiritual practice in a way. I think there is a little bit of softening or of
Mhm.
identification with, oh my God, like this is who I am,
Mhm.
and it can break down in a way.
Right. And I feel like, especially as someone who's in this like spiritual care provider role, like my ego has evolved to be even more insidious. You see, even from this whole conversation, my latest ego issue is thinking that it is my job to point it out to people, right? And be like, I must help you by pointing out all these like subtleties of practice. And that is itself my ego. So I'm like, oh man, like the game gets even harder the more like the more the ego sees us pointing at it, the more it like morphs and shifts into another form. And I'm like, wow, it's amazing.
Exactly. Right. I mean, it's so sneaky.
Mm-hmm.
It's it, it always figures out a way to disguise itself, even
Mm-hmm.
under the guise of like being an egoless person or like a spiritual person or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. I mean, it's usually just the ego having another cloak on, and we
Mm-hmm.
don't even recognize it happening.
Exactly. So for those of you listening, yeah.
Yeah.
Please
What do
let
you?
us know your thoughts on
Yeah.
ego transcendence.
Exactly. Exactly.
I also wanted to mention like an interfaith component to what we're discussing. I know we're talking about Buddhist practice, but to address your earlier point about like mindfulness meditation and its context, I feel like the one part I'm noodling on is like I as a chaplain in training, like what we're learning is actually to practice to support people of all faiths or none. And so like although like my own practice is based on like Buddhist context of meditation, I believe that meditation is helpful even in other religious contexts, and every major religion has its own form of contemplation. It could be prayer, but like I feel like the benefit of all of these has to do with like giving up one's ego. So it could be to like serve God. It could be to understand or to realize the not self nature about being. Like I feel like there's although our language may be very different, as long as we are doing so in a non-ego serving way, I think it can be of great benefit no matter what religious background we're coming from. So I
I love
think
that.
like yeah, and I see that like that's the issue with like mindfulness meditation standalone for um a like purpose of self-improvement, like that's where it kind of like is missing this transcendence component.
Hmm.
So I was wondering, Matthew, like I see like you do a very fantastic job like teaching mindfulness and meditation, and my understanding is that you are providing a lot of the tactical support, right, for like just dealing with particular issues. So are you planning to provide more of this context in your work, or sorry, you're already doing it and I'm missing the latest and greatest?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think so. In certain ways, I definitely want to continue to teach mindfulness and meditation, and to support people in that way who are on a spiritual path.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as like doing that in kind of business consulting realm, in one sense, yes. I am very interested in teaching mindfulness through the practice of improv.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I've mentioned this on the podcast before, and probably to you, but I think it's such a great alternative to mindfulness practice, or as a supplement or an adjunct to mindfulness practice, and it's such a zen practice of stepping into the unknown. And so I'm interested in like delivering and teaching, maybe in kind of different ways. That would be one way, and also working with individuals and organizations. Maybe not directly through mindfulness meditation, but supporting people in the same way, showing up with them and bearing witness and not knowing and being in a process of co-discovering kind of these same principles that come up in Buddhism and in spiritual practice, and being someone who can hold a mirror to that.
That's fantastic. Like, and then do you find folks who are amenable to this? Because I'm trying to imagine, right? If you don't know this is a missing component, would you know what you're searching for?
Yeah, I'm thinking about, like, support. Someone comes with a problem,
Mm-hmm.
and they want some help, and I'm just thinking about that subtle difference between offering a solution and being with someone as they discover that solution. Or
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's not the solution that you even had in mind, right? You together can go on this unfolding process of, how do I best solve this problem within this particular context, meaning at this particular moment? Because some solutions, I think, are context dependent. And so
Mm-hmm.
continuing to just be present and be with people in that unfolding process, I think is something great and something that I get excited about in the consulting world.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And Kristen, I wanted to ask you, we talked a little bit about um, how practice is going for both of us now, but you mentioned one of your edges, which is kind of working with that tension in as far as finances go.
Hard to say, right? Hard to
Gosh,
say out
yeah,
loud.
maybe some Freudian thing is happening. I think I was struggling with it before too. Wow. Um, but what are some other practice edges for you right
Mhm.
now? What are you working with in your practice, and where is that
Mhm.
edge?
Yeah. So I think lately it's that financial component, but also the whole boring path. I would say that that is my practice edge right now. I see that in order to pursue my entrepreneurial path, I end up participating in like social media and like posting, etc., etc. That gets my mind really busy. And I feel like, I'm definitely not practicing what I'm preaching here. Like, I find myself like really stimulated and like really comparing myself to others and to essentially the Brahma Vihara path, the exact opposite. It like happens a lot, right? Um, so I feel like I'm definitely much more aware of this in actually just recent days. I'm like, as I'm preparing to go on a retreat end of this week, I remember thinking, oh gosh, it would really suck to slam the brakes like at the end of the week. I better start slowing down now. So I'm already like, stepping away from my usual online platforms. And like for me, actually, like YouTube is quite an addiction. It's like an endless, like, visual and audio stimulation, right? So I think like these are areas in which I'm, so like there's the five precepts, but there's also the eight precept variant that lay people undertake in traditional Buddhist contexts, and one of them is like avoiding entertainment. And I'm like, oh, there's a reason for that. Like even back in the day, they realized that entertainment, which to them was like going to shows and dancing and whatever, like was already considered a thing that distracts you from practice.
Right.
So, I find like that's been helpful to be much more mindful of.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Some people that might be listening might be rightfully thinking like, oh, well, if I really want to pursue meditation or spiritual practice more seriously, like, does that mean I have to give up like entertainment, or like I have to
Yeah,
give up like alcohol or
I
whatever
know. We're like
vices?
so lame.
What would you say in response
Yeah,
to
that's a
that?
wonderful question. And I feel like it's funny because I've heard these messages from people like so many years ago, and I was like, "Oh God, no! I don't want to do any of that." So one message I've heard from monastics, whom I trust because they really are like giving up everything, is they are the ones going, "Oh no, don't give up anything you're not ready to, because it would totally rebound and you would just be even worse."
Yes. Yes.
So I think there is like this subtlety of giving up where like we call it a renunciation in Buddhism sometimes, right? Where like a conventional meaning of renunciation is like, you know, cutting off something and like giving up in a very like in a way that separates you from the world or something like that. However, I find that eventually after many iterations of trying to give up things, like I realized that like it's really easy to give up if I can see the obvious benefit from doing it. So like for me, like unfortunately I see a direct correlation between me consuming online content and not having particularly peaceful time in my inner world. So then it's like a really obvious trade. And you're reminding me, actually, this also came up in a recent discussion with kind campers, the meditation community I run, where I said there is something that's like a logical predication that's happening that I'm able to make that not all our people are able to make, which is like, it's to some extent, I can access happiness and peace in the present moment. And if you don't have the ability to access this, then it's very hard for you to like convince yourself, right? Because you're trading something that's obviously better, like whatever like sensory stimulants of your choice versus feeling shitty. And I'm like, obviously, like anyone would choose the better thing. And it takes like multiple iterations of practicing mindfulness and meditation and like all these other components to your capacity and availability before one can have access to this inner peace and calm, whatever it may be. Which I want to say, I want to emphasize, I don't have this all the time. If you see me out in the streets, you'll obviously see why. But it's like I know that it's there. It's always been there, and there's like a reassurance sort of situation. And I
I've
feel
never
like that's why I feel bad because if you don't have this, then I'm like, oh, then it doesn't make any sense. So I was wondering for you, Matthew, like how do you make this inner trade, or if there's any trading at all going on in your mind?
Yeah, I want to comment on that, but I wanted to say first that I've actually never heard it. I've never heard someone phrase it that like that. Like, oh, if you can't find happiness and peace in the present moment and you're feeling crappy, well, of course you're going to find some other thing that can stimulate yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That's wonderful. I'm going to be thinking about that. But I would say I am on the same wavelength as you as far as like giving things up, and something that I have to really learn that practice on a daily basis, because there's one thing there's something to telling ourselves, trying to convince ourselves that we should give something up. And as you're saying, it just doesn't work. There's always a rebound process. In
Mm-hmm.
my experience, um, the most effective way to kind of give something up is to really suffer from it. And then you're ready, just like you're saying,
Uh-huh.
like to really experience it. And this is the beautiful part, I think, about this practice, is just like if we just bring awareness to our experience, like even when we're engaging in the vice or the addiction or whatever it is, we'll see at some point there will be enough suffering there that will be motivated to change. And
Mm-hmm.
we actually don't need to necessarily have, it's helpful to have these guidelines and rules about how you should and shouldn't behave, but
Mm-hmm.
that's never going to get someone to truly transform until they're motivated enough internally to do that work, because they've suffered so badly from the behaviors that they're doing.
Right.
So I would just say, like, yeah, keep doing what you're doing. Just bring a lot of awareness to it, and when you're ready to change, when there's been enough suffering there, then
Mm-hmm.
we'll make a shift. life will
Mm-hmm.
life will teach us how to be happy, how to not suffer, if we're willing to pay attention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So related to that, I wanted to revisit when you were mentioning your panic attacks, and I was wondering for you, was it practice that helped you get out of it, or was it a combination of factors? Like, how would you, if someone was coming with the same problem, what would you say to them?
It was practice, but in a very modified way. I actually couldn't practice.
Mm-hmm.
I actually had to step away from my meditation practice
Mm-hmm.
because um, I was experiencing panic attacks, anxiety, like so acutely that just sitting down and closing my eyes and paying attention to my breath would just
Mhm.
throw me into a panic episode.
Mhm. Mhm.
And, someone might say, well, you just need to like sit with that and like ride it out or whatever. But I think at that point, I mean, once you're kind of out of that, they would say like your window of tolerance, like
Mhm.
it's probably not healthy to continue doing that, to continue
Mhm.
being dysregulated.
Mhm.
So one type of practice that was really helpful for me was actually just listening to sounds.
Mm.
That I could do. I couldn't go in and pay attention to my breath, but
Mhm.
I could listen to sounds in the room. I could listen to sounds outside. Listening to the birds chirping was
Mhm.
so helpful for me. And I realized through that process and, and reading about it more, like it's actually helping to orient our brain into the here and now, to connect us to our environment,
Mhm.
and to really tell our nervous system that we're safe. And
Mhm.
sometimes it's hard to get that message by going internally, but we
Mm.
can get that message by opening our eyes and our ears into the here and now. And our brain can then tune and have the sense that, okay, I'm safe here. So that was really helpful. And once things started to get better for me, I could slowly get back to my practice.
Mhm.
But there are still certain days for me where it's like, I know sitting right now is not the best thing for me. And
Mhm.
and there's a voice that's like, well, you just need to like sit through it. But I try to be skillful with it. So sometimes it's like, yeah, I need to do some moving meditation. Like yoga is always fine for me. I don't
Mhm.
get activated by that. So if I'm
Right.
stretching and breathing, beautiful. Going for a
Mhm.
walk, beautiful. So I still make adaptations to that on certain
Mhm.
days.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember you were bringing up like these movement-based practices as being really important, right? And I feel like that's also the thing I didn't realize for the longest time. I came into Buddhism like with a very like pure Zen, like shikantaza, just sitting sort of practice, and I felt like it helped definitely, but it wasn't super like directly addressing some of the whole like slamming the brakes sort of feeling you get. And what I learned much later, listening to monastics from the Theravadan tradition, is that like they have a whole bag of tricks. Like they do qigong and they do yoga and like they do like especially in Thai forest tradition, tons of walking meditation, right? Because they recognize that there is some bodily chi or energy thing that needs to be dissipated before we can go into sitting meditation. And I'm hoping that it'll become more mainstream soon for people to recognize these differences.
Absolutely. And just considering, the what we're all carrying around these days, the amount of stress, the amount of trauma that we're absorbing from things that are happening around us in the world. I think we really need to consider these other ways to help do this practice in a way that it might be different than it was practiced before. So
Mm-hmm.
Kristen, is there anything else that we haven't talked about or anything else that you wanted to share with our audience here about you and your work that we haven't covered yet today?
Oh, thank you for the delightful conversation. I feel like we actually end up covering all the topics that we were dropping into our DMs, because they're all interlinked, right? We talked about like right view, we talked about precept keeping, we talked about modern mindfulness meditation, in with and without context. They are all related to subtle tweaks to the way that meditation is taught today. And I feel like especially the more commercialized app form of meditation, like, does this job of making it really easy to onboard someone to meditation. However, like without all the additional support, like it can leave people a little feeling a little bit disappointed when they don't get the results that they're desiring.
Mhm.
So, however, I also feel like if I was listening to this podcast, I'll be like, okay, there's lots of things I need to fix. It seems like maybe if this person's legit, but what do I do now? Um, and so I have a few offerings that kind of like streamline some of this thinking. So one is a book called Debug Your Meditation, where I compiled the greatest hits of the Buddhist teachers I trust in a FAQ format, so you can look for your question du jour. And it also comes with a children's story, so that it's a little bit fun to read. Do check it out if that's something of interest. I also run a meditation and reflective writing community where I surprise participants with a different flavor of Buddhist practice every twice a month. The idea is to provide the space for you to have your own epiphanies. So I tell campers that I teach nothing. Like, this is not even a course or workshop. What I'm doing is holding the space for your self discovery, and I provide the prompts and like a tiny bit of instruction. But it's not the instruction itself you need to learn; it's whatever you discover inside of yourself that you need to learn. So that's been really fun for me to learn to hold this space and to learn to digest all of the Dharma books and talks I listen to and present it in a more straightforward format. Though of course I'm, definitely very much a beginner at this too, and welcoming all feedback from participants. And thirdly, I'm also offering one-on-one coaching slash consulting. So right now I am helping folks with writing a book in 8 weeks. um, which is a quite of a bit of an ask. However, I'm hoping to make it fun and also to perfuse this with a bit of the Buddhist mindfulness context, so that you can overcome writer's block. You can essentially project manage in a way that is taking an account of your own needs and leading first with loving kindness towards yourself.
Mm.
And I'm hoping to continue to converse with folks who are, if you do have a problem and you would like to think of a solution that, is aligned with the Buddhist context, I'm very open to that as well.
Wonderful.
So, yes, Matthew, a whole bunch of a whole bunch of offerings that I'm continuing to refine.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing those. And I will make sure to link to them in the show notes and to link to your website. But just for people that are listening right now, is it christinchong.com, .org?
Yes, .com.
.com. Okay. Okay. And I will put a link to that. This has been so lovely. I feel like we really did a deep dive into so many great topics. And I do think that we hit on pretty much all the topics we were planning on. So kudos to us for doing that. But we should do another part of this sometime, a part 2, because I know there's a lot more to go. And obviously, we'll continue to stay in touch. I'm looking forward to following your work.
Yes, likewise. And, if you're listening, we would love to hear from you so that we can know what to talk about that's relevant to your needs.
Reach out to Christin or to myself. I'll put my contact info in there as well, and tell us what you liked about this conversation, what questions or concerns or skepticism or whatever you have, and what you want to hear more of. So thank you all for listening, and thank you, Christin, for being here.